War and Politics, 1964. The quarantine of Cuba, abruptly announced 14 days before the elections in 1962, was applauded as a firm stand against communism. New frontier politicians who had been on the verge of defeat because of the administration's soft policy on Cuba were successful at the polls. It later became apparent, however, that instead of taking a strong stand against communists in Cuba, our government had made harmful concessions to communists. Are we having a rerun in 1964? One reason for Senator Goldwater's massive support is public revolt against policy in Vietnam, which prohibits our soldiers from using the best tactics and weapons in war, and when they are captured, abandons them. This policy has not been altered, but retaliation by American ships is being applauded as a firm policy. That is a summary of my report on War and Politics, 1964. The full report after a message from my sponsor. In the 1962 election year, it was generally apparent that the New Frontier administration was in political trouble because of its soft Cuban policy. On October 22nd, 14 days before the elections, President Kennedy abruptly announced a quarantine of Cuba. The president said he had just discovered what astute observers had known for 2 years, that the Soviets had established in Cuba missile sites with the capability of striking the heartland of the United States. We did not stop or search any communist ships to determine whether they were hauling missiles in or out of Cuba. We made no on-site inspections to determine that missiles had been removed. We merely took Khrushchev's word that the missiles were being removed. On October 29, Arthur Sylvester, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, admitted that the administration was giving the public false information about Cuba. He called this practice proper management and control of the news. Nonetheless, the administration was widely praised for taking a firm stand in Cuba and forcing Khrushchev to back down. The attitude of the voting public was affected. New Frontier senators and representatives who had been on the verge of political defeat were successful in the general elections of November 6. 14 days after the elections, the president announced that the Cuban quarantine was being lifted immediately because Khrushchev had promised to take offensive weapons out of Cuba. There was no hint in the president's tone or words about the reliability of a Khrushchev promise, although 14 days before the election, when announcing the quarantine, the president had called Khrushchev a liar. Later, the obvious became apparent to all willing to face facts. Instead of taking a strong stand against communism in Cuba, our government had made harmful concessions to communism in exchange for saber-rattling that had had a well-timed effect on American elections. Are we having a rerun in 1964? In May of the general election year 1964, the Hearst Headline Service distributed from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a news story which said, quote, 7 of the U.S. Army's elite Special Forces soldiers are prisoners of the Red Guerrillas in South Vietnam, and there is no evidence of any effort to rescue them. The soldiers are being paraded through villages as prizes of war. They're being led by ropes tied about their necks. Hope for all 7 fades with each day of the brutalizing indignity. 2 were captured in October, 4 in November, and 1 in March. It is an old communist trick used by them on other Americans captured in Laos. It is calculated to break a man physically and psychologically. There is bitterness and grumbling among Special Forces soldiers here about a reported refusal by higher authority to let their comrades in Vietnam carry out a rescue strike mission to save those men whose whereabouts are known. One young Special Forces veteran who spent 6 combat-filled months in Vietnam put it this way: if we don't go grab those guys out of the bag, they're going to die, and their death will be on the hands of all Americans. I'd gladly fly back out there right now to help get them. Who are these communist guerrillas anyway? They're not 9 feet tall, they're not even 5 feet tall. What kind of a country is this, with all our power, letting a bunch of half-pint, 2-bit guerrillas do a thing like this to us? Initial responsibility for the decision not to rescue the captured Americans rests with the U.S. ambassador in Saigon. Ultimate responsibility rests with President Johnson. End quote. Like the war in Korea, the war in South Vietnam is waged from the American side with self-imposed limitations against provoking the principal enemy. Communist guerrillas are trained in Communist North Vietnam by Communist China and the Soviet Union, by land, by Soviet airlift, and by sea. Troops and supplies from North Vietnam are moved into Laos, which is off limits for South Vietnamese because Laos is neutral. From their safe bases in Laos, Communist guerrillas have a choice of hundreds of trails for raids across the border into South Vietnam. When they meet opposition, they retreat to safety in privileged sanctuaries, where American policy will not permit them to be followed or their supply bases attacked. A principal sea route by which Soviet and Communist Chinese supply the Communist guerrillas is the Tonkin Gulf, an arm of the South China Sea, washing the shores of North Vietnam and Communist China. Since early 1963, a few U.S. naval units have patrolled in Tonkin Gulf. Their exact mission has never been made clear. Apparently, they are intended to conduct some sort of surveillance of communist supplies being shipped to South Vietnam guerrillas, though there has never been any indication of effort to stop such shipments. Indeed, it is difficult to imagine how our Navy could close the Tonkin Gulf sea traffic in supplies to guerrillas in South Vietnam, since the traffic is in small vessels which hug the shore well inside the 3-mile limit which our vessels carefully avoid. On July 15, 1964, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona was nominated the Republican candidate for president. One of many reasons for Goldwater's massive public support is that millions of Americans are sick of the policy initiated by Truman in Korea and continued by Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, which involves our sons in foreign wars, prohibits them from using the best tactics and weapons to win the wars, and when they are captured, abandons them to humiliation, torture, and death. It was obvious that administration policies in Vietnam would become a damaging campaign issue against President Johnson in the elections this year. Something had to be done. On August 2nd, the U.S. destroyer Maddox was on patrol in Tonkin Gulf, 30 miles off the coast of North Vietnam. 3 small, high-speed North Vietnamese torpedo boats, made in the Soviet Union, approached the Maddox in an attack maneuver, refusing to stop when the Maddox fired shots across their bows. A U.S. aircraft carrier patrolling nearby sent planes to help, the pilots under instructions not to fire unless they or the Maddox were fired upon. The attacking PT boats fired but missed. Answering fire from the Maddox and from U.S. planes hit all 3 attacking boats, sinking 1, damaging the other 2. The U.S. destroyer C. Turner Joy was sent into Tonkin Gulf to reinforce the Maddox, and another U.S. carrier was moved in from Hong Kong. On August 4, 1964, an undetermined number of North Vietnamese PT boats attacked the Maddox and the C. Turner Joy in the Tonkin Gulf, this time about 65 miles off the coast of North Vietnam. The American vessels, with air assistance from the 2 carriers, repulsed the attacks. On specific orders from President Johnson, American planes attacked North Vietnam shore installations, destroying 4 PT boat bases, approximately 25 PT boats, and 1 major oil storage facility. 2 U.S. planes were shot down. 1 pilot was presumed dead, the other presumed captured. On August 7, both houses of Congress, at the request of President Johnson, passed a resolution approving the President's action and endorsing future use of all necessary measures in the area. Political observers concluded that the Tonkin Gulf affair had dampened the major Republican issue in the forthcoming presidential election. A member of the House of Representatives Republican Policy Committee who voted for the resolution said, "Mr. Johnson has done it to us again," end quote. The only 2 votes against the resolution were cast in the Senate by Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon, who said the resolution gave President Johnson blanket authority to wage war, and by Senator Ernest Gruning of Alaska, who said, "All Vietnam is not worth the life of a single American boy." I, a constitutional conservative, must agree with these 2 ultra-liberal Democrat senators, whom I have hardly ever agreed with before. Congressional passage of the Southeast Asia resolution to display American unity was a dreadful mistake. If our performance in 3 major wars of this century has not proved to the world that this country will unite despite politics to fight a war, certainly no resolution of Congress will prove it. The important thing for this country is to avoid war. We cannot avoid war, whether we do get tough or remain soft about communist aggressions and atrocities, if we continue the policy of world meddling, saddling this nation with the responsibility of defending all other nations. Many do not want to be defended. They accept our defense merely because their ruling cliques are growing rich on our money, or using it to keep themselves in power, or because military assistance to some compels others to arm themselves with American equipment. None of them, however, none of them would ever use what we give them to fight communists if we again become involved in a major war with a major communist power. We cannot prevent other nations from warring with one another, and we cannot prevent them from turning to communism, and we have no business trying. We could keep our own nation out of war, however, if we would maintain such national defense that none would dare to touch us, and if we would return to the traditional American foreign policy of benign neutrality, which George Washington laid down in 1796. The massive efforts made with American tax money to keep the world safe from communism has in many areas of the world bought socialism for the communists, and in Latin America particularly is turning the country to communism. Goodbye. God bless you. For the documented text of this broadcast, send 25 cents to Dan Smoot, Dallas 14, Texas, and ask for 469, War and Politics, 1964. 6 copies, $1.